Alicia. Good morning, everyone. So like Alicia said, I'm going to talk about military mental health. I've been involved in healthcare with the military for about 16 years in a couple different capacities, and in the last 3 or 4 years now, I've worked in behavioral health on the civilian side, currently over at the VA. So a couple quick admin notes. We're going to do a break, I think, around 10. Yeah. And as we're going through this whole deal, if anybody has any questions, if anybody wants to interject with anything, if anybody has any statements or wants to add anything to the group, by all means, just holler out at me, raise your hand. I won't be offended. So we're going to kind of hop right into this. These are some of the talking points we're going to talk about today. First off, we're going to start off with the demographics of the veteran population as a whole, just to kind of get a population sample. Then we're going to go into the statistics off of military families, as well as some of the mental health issues that can plague military families. Then we're going to get into the consequences, mental health consequences of deployments, as well as general military life. We'll get into some of the resources and treatments that are available both by DoD as well as the VHA, which is the VA system. And then finally, we're going to finish off with mental health screening and surveillance. That's more on the DoD side. It's going to go into DHA, which is pre-deployments, post-deployments, and annual assessments that the DoD does to try to kind of keep a pulse on the general health of our service members. So, veteran demographics. An easy way to look at it, is anybody here a veteran themselves? I know at least one, so there's several. So that's what, 2? So that kind of ish makes sense. 7.6% of the population comes from a veteran background. That number is actually greatly decreasing over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. A current number right now is right about 20 million. It's going to go down to less than 14 million. That's largely due to 2 different things. First off is the passing of our World War II era veterans, and the second one is the transition in the 70s from a draft to an all-volunteer military. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. Or it's sad that the World War II generation is going away, but there's nothing we can do about that. So those are the 2 factors that are kind of doing that. Another big change in the demographics from an era standpoint is the transition from Vietnam era vets as being the primary or the majority share to the Gulf era vets. That Gulf era vets is actually everybody from 1990 to present. So it's not just our recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield. So there's kind of a passing of the torch of the primary share right now. They're both right about even. I think the Gulf vets just took over by like less than 0.5%. That kind of goes back to what I was saying about the World War II vets. We're not going to really talk much about them because I hate to say it like that, but it's a pretty minimal share at this point. As we're losing them, their World War II era vets encompass 16 million folks. We're losing 350 a day, and that number as of last year was less than 500,000. So that's a pretty major decrease. Obviously, that graph kind of shows you going forward to 2029, losing them quite a bit. So that's taking away from our total numbers of vets. Here's some demographics. So this is specific not to DoD, but to veterans as a whole. 91% male, 9% female. The number of women vets right now is greatly increasing. Over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, it's going to almost double, or actually it is going to double, up to 18%. That makes sense. Obviously, there's a lot more opportunities for women in the last 20, 30 years than there was in the past, so it's kind of a natural thing. Also projected to become younger. There's a graph coming up next that will show how we're steadily getting a little bit younger in the vets, again, probably to do with the World War II eras. And then obviously, we're getting a more diverse force on the active duty side, and also, as a result of that, on the veteran status once they get out. Similar to the number doubling for women veterans, there's a reason for that, and it's because there's a lot more opportunities. At one point, the military was obviously discriminatory against certain races and ethnicities. That's gone away in the last 60, 70 years. So that's giving us a more diverse demographic. So this is kind of look at overall demographics. You can see at the top, that's just kind of backing up what we were talking about. It's looking at the top bar is current, or as of 3 years ago. The bottom one's 2045. You can see the World War II and Korea folks are a minority right now. That will ultimately be gone. The Vietnam and the Gulf War were neck and neck in 2016 at 33. And then you've got Post-Gulf War, other peacetime. The other peacetime encompasses a couple different times, the majority of the Cold War, as well as going forward. That's probably pretty optimistic. That would, that bottom number would reflect that we have no conflicts over the course of the next 30 years, and I doubt that. So anyway, hopefully, that'd be nice. Below that, that shows the age that I talked about. You can see that right now, the under 50 crowd is 27%. By 2045, it's going to encompass 33%, which goes back to what I said about the overall demographic becoming younger. 50 to 69 is going to also decrease, so that 6% is going down. And then the 70-plus crowd pretty much stayed, or is going to stay projectedly the same. Going back to the diversity, we can see that there's a shifting of Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians. Again, that's going back to the fact that there's more opportunities and less discrimination today than there was in, let's say, the World War II era, even Korea era military. And the bottom one, that's just going back to what we talked about with the women doubling their role over the course of the next 30 years, from 9% to 18%. Obviously, several of these things are going to make a significant change or alter the way that healthcare is looked at. Women's health is a big one. That's something that now you look at the VAs, they're coming out with the women's health outpatient clinics. DOD's changing, TRICARE's changing to encompass some of the individual needs that women veterans have that are may differ from males. It's the same thing. It's just showing that shift. You can see it's on the rise, and it's going to continue to rise over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. I'm going to shift over now to military family statistics. So, military families, from a spouse standpoint, we'll get into children in a second, but from a spouse standpoint, it's 95% to 5%. So 95% of military spouses are female, with 5% being male. That number is obviously different when it comes to dual military families, and younger than 35 years old. So military member is more likely to marry younger. I'm sure anybody around here could tell you that. In the civilian world, it's kind of rare to see a 19-year-old on his third marriage, but it's not terribly uncommon in the military. Obviously, people are marrying younger. They're having children at a younger age, so it's not uncommon to see somebody in their early 20s with several children. That still happens everywhere, but it's not as prevalent. One major thing to think about is military families. It says deploy, but move 10 times more on average than their civilian counterparts. That's going to throw in a wrench into some of the family dynamics. If you have somebody, a child growing up that's been to, let's say, 7, 8 schools, by the time they're 18, shifting away from friends. And then the same goes for potentially the spouse. Not this could be a woman or a man, but think about anyone here that's lived somewhere for more than 10, 15 years. You probably have a support structure of friends and or family because you live close. If you have a spouse that doesn't have that, that can be a trying situation. Going to kind of shift over to talking about the kids now, the children. So post 9/11, 2 million children have had a military parent deploy since 9/11. That's a significant number, with almost half, just under half of that, having experienced one or both parents deploy more than once. So clearly one of the significant, or not significant, but different things about the post 9/11 generation as opposed to an extent the Vietnam generation, and certainly all of the American conflicts prior to that, is that it was a long war where it wasn't uncommon for multiple deployments. So for instance, 4 years ago, there was an Army Ranger, I can't pronounce his name, so I'm not going to say it, but he was killed, 29 years old, 14th deployment. That's a significant amount of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So obviously, yes?
I don't mean to interrupt you.
No, go for it.
I was just amazed when I heard I had students and that they were deployed like 4 or 5 times.
Oh, yeah?
Doesn't the people in charge know that you're destroying these people?
So we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end. And actually, I'm going to give you a twofold answer on that. The health assessments at the end. Remind me if I don't bring that up, because that's a good point. The other thing is a lot of that's going to be voluntary. So, and I feel I understand what you're saying, but that's a portion of it.
It's their job. But somebody has to say, okay, somebody else take a turn.
Sure, yeah, I agree. And you're absolutely right. There's people doing 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and people doing 0. So for sure. I totally agree. But anyway, so going away from the individual service member and talking about the family and specifically the children, that also has an effect. It can become an absentee parent situation. Not necessarily on purpose, but it's what it turns into. If you have somebody that's deployed 6, 7, 8 times over the course of their children's formative years, that's going to have an effect. It's hard to argue. This is going to be some of the results of it. So right there, children in military families experience a higher rate of mental health trauma-related problems. They're reported 1 in 4 reporting SI, and 30% reporting prolonged depression. That's a big number. It's, I think, 11% higher than civilian family counterpart. Spouses, they're at a greater risk as well. That second one is an interesting statement, I think. It shows that a deployed spouse versus a non-deployed, or a spouse of a deployed member, vice a spouse of a non-deployed member, there's a, 7%, so 20% difference in the ultimate risk for a mental health diagnosis. That's a big one. And then I added this to it just because I think it's interesting. It's something we don't necessarily think about. Bereavement experts report that for every service member lost on active duty, there's 10 family members that are significantly affected. What significantly means, I'm not exactly sure. I'm going to take a guess and say, obviously, ideally, if you pass away, there's more than 10 people that are affected. But significantly affected might be affected on a mother, father, children, spouse, brother, sister, etc. It's something that's going to stay with them. It's not, like you're reading the newspaper and being down about it. Vice, this being a major, major impact on your livelihood, possibly fiscally, as well as mentally and emotionally. So it's something to think about. So if we lose 6,500 people on active duty over the course of a conflict, multiply that by 10, and that's the ultimate cost from an emotional and mental health standpoint. So we're going to jump into the mental health consequences of deployments. It says deployments, but we're going to actually tag onto that just military life in general as well. PTS, whatever we want to call it, PTSI, PTS, PTSD. For the sake of the rest of the slides, we're going to call it PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
What does the I mean?
Injuries. So it's an attempt to get away from the stigma of it being a disorder is PTSI, which is post-traumatic stress injury. The idea is that I agree, but the idea is that there's a stigmatization of disorder as being, a weakness or something. Depression, major depression, depressive disorder. Suicide, that's going to be a big one. We'll talk about that. Clearly, that's a hot ticket item. We hear a lot about it. We hear a lot of numbers. We hear a lot of brands. So we're going to talk about that. Then we'll talk about substance abuse disorder as well as polysubstance abuse disorder, how that has an effect, and kind of what the overall effect is on both DoD as well as the veteran community. So, post-traumatic stress disorder. It is a mental health condition triggered by an event witnessed and or experienced. It's a stress reaction to a traumatic event. It can occur in less than a month of the traumatic event or lay dormant for years. The symptoms can be grouped into 4 types. We're about to go into that. I'd like to do an aside. PTSD, I feel like, is one of those things that has become a military issue, which it is not. And I want to make a point to say that because I feel like people get to this idea that the only PTSD out there, or the main PTSD out there, is a combat-related situation, which isn't true. The fact is, sexual trauma, childhood abuse, childhood neglect, car accidents, violence towards a person. There's many, many, many factors that can be traumatic enough to ultimately result in a PTSD diagnosis. That said, I'm going to be the guy that talks about the military side of it because that's the whole point of this brief. But I just like to mention that clearly there's a lot more than just combat-related. Also, later on, we're going to talk about military sexual trauma, and we're going to get into how that is also a rising thing when it comes to PTSD. So, PTSD symptoms. We're going to divide the symptoms up, or group the symptoms up into 4 different categories. Intrusive memories, avoidance, negative changes in thinking and mood, and changes in reaction. That's both physical and emotional reactions. Intrusive memories. There's like the classic one that everybody's heard of, flashbacks. So that's a situation where one is involuntarily, unwantedly, I don't know if that's a word, but involuntarily reliving the trauma again. So that's one that everyone's heard of. Nightmares, terrors, night terrors, these are situations while asleep where you relive the trauma again. Emotional and physical reactions to something that's reminiscent of the trauma, that's a big one. So that would be an emotional response to an idea or something that is not dangerous that brings someone back, is reminiscent of the trauma that initially set off the PTSD. Yes, ma'am.
I work with a veteran that had been in Vietnam, and if you walk by a Chinese restaurant, the food, triggered.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of things, all the sensory stuff. Look at heat, temperatures, driving. Driving is a big one. So people get used to, especially in the last couple wars, or last 2 wars, convoy operations is a big thing. The rise of IEDs, the rise of stuff like that. A lot of folks will have issues with driving. You're cruising through there, you see a Dasani bottle on the side of the road. That's not something that an average person is going to even think about. But if you just came back from, let's say, 9 months of daily convoy ops and you'd seen multiple pressure plates rigged up to this or that, it's going to have an effect. So your senses, cognitively you're going to associate something that is not dangerous or that is not bad with a negative negative memory. So that's a big one. We'll get into that a little bit too. But yeah, for sure. You're a patient that had that issue with whether it was a smell or whatever it was, the smell. Okay, sure. So it's a sensation. So that makes sense. And then finally, recurrent unwanted memories causing distress. So it's one thing to think back on negative things that have happened in your life. It's a normal human reaction. We're all going to do that. The loss of a loved one. We can do that consciously. We're consciously thinking back on something bad for whatever reason, trying to get ourselves through it. There's many a reason. This is talking about recurrent unwanted. So you're trying not to think about something, but it's happening anyway. That's specifically unwanted. Avoidance. So that kind of goes right off of that. So avoidance. That's avoiding thinking or speaking about whatever the event that induced the trauma was. Avoiding people, places, and activities that are reminiscent of the trauma. So kind of going back to the patient or the individual that you're working with, you get to a point where you're like, okay, I'm going to avoid driving, or I'm going to avoid going to a location that gives me some memory, some reminiscence of a traumatic event. These are a normal reaction to get through a day-to-day situation. If you know that, hey, I'm going to struggle driving, you might say, in the here and now, I'm going to avoid driving. That's really not a good response. That's going to be, it can get you by on a day-to-day basis, but long-term, it's still repression. It's going to come back to you. But it's a normal thing that people do just to get through the here and now. So it makes sense. Negative changes in thinking and mood. So this one and the fourth one kind of go a little bit together, but this is more just from a thinking and a mood-based. Hopelessness, inability to experience positive emotions, inability to feel happy, negative perception, not only of oneself, but also of one's environment, difficulty in relationships with others. That could be any type of relationship. It could be work relationships. It could be family relationships. It could be friendships, sexual relationships, intimate relationships, all types of relationships. And that kind of is based off of a detachment to one's surroundings. So you have a detachment to the society that you're a member of. You feel like you're an outlier, that you're on the outskirts of society. Memory problems, blocking out the traumatic event. That kind of goes back to avoidance. You get yourself in a memory block where you've completely shut down that event and you don't want to go back to it. You don't want to think about it. You don't want to try to work through it. You don't want to try to get some acceptance of that part of your life. You just block it out. Lack of interest in things that were once enjoyed. Let's say at one point you enjoyed golfing or you enjoyed working out or you enjoyed doing whatever. Now that brings you no pleasure. It brings you no interest. And then finally, an emotional numbness. So it kind of goes up with the second one.
Well, I mean, these are symptoms of clinical depression.
Of everything that we're going to talk about
but
today.
I'm thinking, could it be trust that the world is no longer safe?
I agree, yes.
Because of where they were,
Sure.
enemy, and I thought that was the difference between World War II vets and these, because when they're in in the civilian population who wants to kill you. It's kind of black and white.
So military operations in urban terrain are not a new thing. It's something that we think about because we think about door-to-door military operations, which is going into cities, towns. That's not anything new. I mean, they've been doing that since World War II. Certainly, definitely in Vietnam, the whole Tet Offensive, that's what it was. The Tet Offensive was door-to-door. So that's not anything I don't think new. Obviously, I wasn't in Vietnam or World War II, but I'm not so sure there's a whole different change. I would actually argue that the big difference, I think you're kind of onto something, would more be the repeat deployments as opposed to, let's say, World War II. There was folks in World War II that were, going in the military in 1942 and came home in 1945. That's just pretty crazy. That's like a 3-year deployment. That's pretty insane. But there's reports that say that it actually might be more of a stabilizer than our, let's say, multiple 6-month, 9-month, 1 year, 18-month deployments for a few reasons. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and talk about that now because there's not a slide for it. I think the biggest one would be an overall stabilizer. If you look at PTSD, it's going to be sustained traumatic events and or a super intense traumatic event, right? So if you look at those two things, talk about a sustained traumatic event being a 9-month deployment. Let's say there's 5 individual intense events that potentially would be trauma causing, but there's also just the general 9 months of unease, of feeling like you're in a dangerous situation, never really bringing yourself down. So that goes through. If it's on in the days of the past where it's maybe a 3-year deployment, you kind of go through that with a group, right? So you're going through that with a peer-based support group, which is the folks that you're there with, right? You get that, the war, in those guys' cases, the war ends. Then they had a long period, let's say 6 months. I know I read a book one time about the Pacific, and in the Pacific, there was a point. There was in the European theater too, but there was a point system to get home. We just didn't have logistical capability to shoot everybody home, so it wound up being a occupation force that was there for 6 months. So they kind of went, if you think about it, ramped themselves up to kind of an extreme point, and then had a draw back down, sort of to cruise into normal life, where they had a support structure around them, and they were able to kind of do it together and just kind of gradually wind down into civilian life. That's, I'm assuming, a good thing. That's got to be a positive. If you look at Vietnam, it's a really crazy number. The majority of guys and women and girls that went to Vietnam, it was a 1 tour and out. If you look at the draftees, it was typically a 13-month tour and they went home. Obviously, some lifers or some career people maybe did multiple. But if you look at this war, OIF and OEF, and I'm not even going to mention Desert Storm, not to take away from it, but that was a shorter conflict. You look at OIF and OEF, even one enlistment guys and girls, people that did 4 years. I know multiple guys, specifically guys actually, that did 4 years and did 3 deployments. So that's 3 7 to 8 month deployments over the course of 4 years. That's never happened before, if you think about it from a U.S. military standpoint. That type of, back and forth, up and down, I think is very unique to the OIF-OEF generation, and I think it might be part of some of the issues that have come about. If you think about it, you do 7 months sustained. I'm saying 7 months. The Marine Corps typically runs 7 to 8 month deployments. 7 to 8 month deployment. You come off that deployment. Maybe you're in a battalion or a regiment where you come home. You're home for 4 months. Then you regroup, go back into a pre-deployment phase. 6 months later, you're back overseas. I think that up and down can be dangerous. People are just, it's just going from one extreme, one high to one low. It can't be good. And I think the numbers are proving that. I think the patient base coming out of OIF and OEF is showing it as well. So anyway, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, I kind of wasn't planning on going into that, but I think it's very interesting. So, yeah, for sure. So, numbers to emotions. Let's hop to the next one. This is our fourth category of symptoms. So this is more of some physical reactions. Easily startled, trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating, self-destructive behaviors. I'm going to go back to that. Aggressive behaviors, irritability, guilt, guardedness, always on alert, feeling like you need to protect yourself in scenarios where you maybe usually would not be thinking about your direct safety. The other interesting thing about all the four that we've talked about, going back to what you just said, these are all going to be, we're going to see these things over and over and over again in each one of the issues that we're talking about, suicide and depressive disorders as well. I want to go back to self-destructive behaviors. We're going to talk about substance abuse disorders and polysubstance abuse disorders sort of towards the end of the slides, but I want to mention self-destructive behaviors. When we think of that, we think of substance abuse, or at least I think I usually would think of substance abuse, whether it's drug use, alcohol use, whatever. There's more to it than that. I think you see a lot of people that maybe look like they're doing well outwardly. You know, maybe they're not abusing, or you don't see them abusing drugs or alcohol. You see them being successful. You maybe even see them finding extreme success. You know, like the people that you're like, wow, man, he did whatever he did, and he came home and he did this and he did this and he did this and he did this. That's incredible. But a lot of that can be self-destructive too. For instance, I have a really good friend of mine. He's into climbing. He's now one of the guys that's getting into this free solo stuff. He's got some stuff going on, and everybody's saying, "Oh yeah, this guy's awesome. Like he's killing it or whatever." And I'm guilty of thinking that too. But clearly, there's got to be a correlation. You know what I mean? This is a guy that wasn't doing that stuff at one point, and I think part of that, in addition to PTSD, or maybe kind of going along with PTSD. It's also going back to what we were talking about with the extreme highs and the extreme lows. I think there's something to be said about getting yourself to a level, you know what I mean, and hitting a level that maybe in normal circumstances you never would. And it can be a little bit euphoric. It's exciting. You know, there still is something to be said about the excitement factor of combat, of experiencing combat. That's a very you're on your RPMs are out the roof, like you're at a high RPM. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Years ago, this is like back in the early 80s, I worked with a guy who was a Vietnam War vet, and anyway, it's one of the worst cases of PTSD I've ever seen. And every time a film came out, like Full Metal Jacket or Apocalypse Now, some kind of pulp novel about the war, he'd be the first in line to get it. So we asked him, so why is it? This was like the worst hell you've ever been through. Why do you keep going back to it? And he said something I will never forget as long as I live. He said, because it may have been the worst thing I ever experienced, but it was the time when I felt the most alive.
For sure. Totally. I think there's something to be said about peaking, and there's something to be said, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know, but about peaking at a pretty young age. If you've got somebody that's realistically, I agree that they should be afforded all the rights and responsibilities of an adult. But I know when I was 19, I was not an adult. I was living an adult-ish life, but I certainly was not an adult. I was still a child, like totally for sure. I still am, actually, to be honest with you. But when you're able to go straight from school, from mom and dad, in an ideal situation, mom and dad taking care of you, and then hopping into a situation like that. Let's say you're 21 years old, 22 years old. Let's say you're squad leader at that point. That's a lot of power. That's a position that most 22-year-olds are never going to be in. In all honesty, most 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, people their whole lives, are never going to be in. And I think people kind of get off on, that's bad. That's not what I meant. People get excited about, go ahead.
Well, it's biological. It's an adrenaline rush.
Yeah,
You get
sure.
hooked on that like emergency technicians. But also I'm thinking twofold. When they're doing this stuff, it's an escape from any other drug.
For sure.
Adrenaline. But then they don't have to focus on pain. But they'll eventually crash.
Yeah, like the epinephrine of it. That all makes sense. And again, I think you start chasing something. You're chasing a feel. If you look at a lot of drug addicts chasing heroin, people that are chasing that ultimate buzz or whatever. I think that's a thing. Yes, sir.
I think you can really think of it as a kind of numbing, because what they're responding to is their adrenaline, not their emotions.
Yeah. You're not having to think through anything. For sure, yeah. So I think you see a lot of that. And again, when we talk about self-destructive behaviors, we think about the alcohol and the drugs. But there's certainly quite a bit more to it. To include relationships. That's another good one to talk about. Relationships. Somebody, a young person comes out. It's kind of normal when you're young to come in and out of relationships, do all these type of things. That's normal. Well, most of us, I think that that's a normal trait for a young person. So sometimes it can get coded. So let's say that somebody comes home, for all intents and purposes, they look like they're doing okay, but they're bouncing around between partners. When you're 21, you're 22, 23 years old, whatever, in your 20s, it's not an uncommon thing. It can start to kind of be blocked until a later age when you're like, well, wait a second, why is so-and-so, that's a self-destructive behavior, inability to commit to intimacy, with a partner. So that's self-destructive. Self-destruction there's a lot of aspects of it that aren't necessarily just what we think of, which is substance abuse. But we're going to talk about substance abuse too, though. So, risk factors. So risk factors, obviously, we talked earlier about it. It could be an incident of intense, an intense trauma or a prolonged trauma, or both. It's all very dependent on the person. Some risk factors: pre-existing mental health conditions, history of depression, pre-existing conditions of previous trauma, let's say childhood trauma, sexual trauma, childhood neglect, any number of things, experiencing car accidents. There's any number of traumatic events in a previous situation that can ultimately come back to be a risk factor for later trauma. Job or lifestyles that increase risk for traumatic experiences. We're talking about the military, certainly not only. I know there's a lot of medical folks here. That's a big one right there. Trauma, people that see trauma on a daily basis, whether it's, we always talk about LEO, law enforcement, that's a good example. We talk about firefighters, we talk about paramedics, EMS, that's one. In a more clinical environment, in a more controlled environment, it's still true. Think about PQ nurses, think about NICU, think about physicians, people that work in the ER. Those are all clearly trauma-inducing careers. I remember a few years ago, there was a picture, I don't know if y'all seen that or saw that. It was a doc that was at, I think it was like Chicago, one of the big hospitals, LA Trauma or something like that, and he came out and he was kind of standing on a bridge. It was a really good picture. I think it was Time magazine. But he had just come over, he had blood all over, his scrubs. It was kind of like a traumatic picture. It was really well taken. Whoever took it, it was crazy. It's probably made up, but it looked good. And I think it expresses a good point, which is just that we're able to kind of get fixated on the military thing, but there's trauma-inducing careers everywhere, traumatic event, risky careers everywhere. Genetic predisposition, just like everything, that plays a part. We talked about previous trauma. We talked about pre-existing mental conditions. Here's a big one, and we'll go back to this. Failure to detect early, failure to maintain a support system. That's a big one, and we're going to go back to that at the end when we talk about DHA, which is those surveillance questionnaire. We'll go into that later. But that's a big one. We're about to see a number, I think, in the next slide where it's talking about the Vietnam generation. I want to talk about that for a second because that's an example of a demographic that didn't get early surveillance. And I think that had, I know that had long-term effects. It might be the next slide. Okay, it isn't, but this one's important too. So we can see here, prevalent is spelled wrong. It should be an A. But in 2015, that's VA claims, the most prevalent VA claims made. If you look at all the blue ones, that's pretty basic stuff. Tinnitus, people get that. It's not a military-only thing. People's ears go out. Hearing loss, people's ears go out. Back conditions, people have back conditions. Knee conditions, scars general, ankle conditions, migraines. Those are all things that we would think are going to break down on a human body. How is it any different with PTSD, which is literally right there with migraines, ankle injuries, scars, and a little bit less than knee conditions? That's the type of prevalence. This isn't an uncommon thing. It's not any different, really, I guess, than any of these other things, and it just shows how often it's occurring. And thankfully, the VA is making these claims, and ideally these folks are getting some disability compensation, or more importantly, they're getting allocated the resources that they need. So that's a good thing. That's an increase. They're not where they need to be, but that's an increase. PTSD within the military. So we're looking at the last three. I don't know the rates for the Korean War or World War II era folks. probably they don't have them, is my guess. They're too old, number one. And number two, I'm just kidding about that. I have all the respect in the world for World War II and Korea veterans. But, you know, that was a time frame where we weren't talking about this type of stuff. You know, back when it was combat fatigue, you know, pre-PTSD verbiage, combat fatigue and shell shock in World War I, all these things. It was something that was pocketed away, and I'm sure our society is full of reasons or ultimate, yes ma'am. Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom, Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah. OIF is Iraq, OEF is Afghanistan. There's New Dawn too, which is the new one. There's another one too. It's hard to keep up with. But 11 to 20% is the numbers for, those are off of claims. The way they're getting those numbers is off of claims through VHA. Keep in mind only a third of veterans are actually enrolled in VHA. So with the other 2/3, who knows? And then the rest are self-reports. I don't know the sample size, but that's a pretty wide margin. It's 10% error on, or 10% disparity on that. But anyway, the number they're putting out from VA.gov is 11 to 20%. Gulf War, 12%. So it's right there, about the same. And then Vietnam. This is what I wanted to talk about with Vietnam. During the Vietnam era generation, guys, coming to and from Vietnam, it was another long war like the current one is. We didn't have the infrastructure and we didn't have the resources that we do today. So we can kind of bash the lack of resources now, and I think we should. I think we should always try to get better. But certainly when you compare this, my generation, to the Vietnam generation, huge difference, you know what I mean, in resources and just in social, which I think we're about to talk about too, but social acceptance of the war, of understanding of what these people did, what these guys and girls went through, and all of that. I think it's significant. Vietnam is a good example of a war where a relative minority went and the rest of the world really didn't know it. It was right about the time where we started being able to, again, I didn't live there, I'm 34 years old, but we started to kind of see it with news. You know, the news was going over there. People were starting to see on their television, you know, clips of what was going on in Southeast Asia. So, but anyway, they weren't getting their support. So the numbers that VA.gov is putting out right now for Vietnam PTSD was always 15%. But that 15% number was coming from a big survey that was done in the late 80s, 89 or 88, when Vietnam was still relatively fresh, you know, 15, 20 years old. So at that point, it was a 15% claim. In the last post-9/11 time frame, there's been a whole new advent of Vietnam vets coming in and getting PTSD consoles, and a lot of them ultimately getting claims, and getting disability ratings because of that PTSD. So I put the asterisk there to add the 30% because that's what surveys are putting out now, that number is actually 30%. I think that's telling, and I think it's telling for a few reasons, or two reasons really. The first reason would be, number one, I think a lot of the Vietnam vets that didn't feel comfortable going to get help with the post-9/11 generation, they did. They became comfortable. When they saw how it was becoming a socially acceptable thing, taken away from the stigmatization of it, they were willing to go get seen. So that's one nice, positive thing. The negative thing is I think that potentially guys and girls that could have probably gotten taken care of early and not gone through as much hardship and negativity in their life didn't. They repressed it, they avoided it, and when they did that, it became a bigger issue. And by the time they ultimately went in and started getting treatment, it had already taken itself, manifested in a whole new thing. Yes, ma'am.
My friend is the director of AMVETS,
Okay.
and she told me, I was surprised too, that a whole group of very successful people that have been Vietnam vets, pilots and stuff, when they reached retirement age, they had time to reflect. They had been so busy, and she said they totally crashed.
Yeah, for sure. They had all that extra time.
Yep.
Yeah, so I totally agree with that. Yeah, for sure. They were able to fill. Yeah. I think that's probably true of a lot of people. Kind of going back to the self-destructive behavior, I think that can manifest into a total obsession with whatever you're doing professionally. You know what I mean? Instead of dealing with your own emotional trauma or your own, centric stuff. Yes, ma'am.
There's also the phenomenon with the new veterans coming out triggering the Vietnam era veterans.
Yeah.
So there's that, and the delayed onset, because some people, it doesn't hit until later.
Yeah, for sure.
And so
Sub 30 or
it's a
years?
combination of things. So even with the OIF, OEF, I would expect
More.
20 years from now or 30 years from now, we're going to have a greater number.
Absolutely. You think about, like she just said, when they start retiring, when whatever our next big war overseas hits, that could, manifest into something. Yeah, for sure. I think these are all living, breathing numbers that, will increase. And again, at the end of the day, we're going off of like a third of the VA population, not the VA population, of the veteran demographic, because there's 2/3 of them that are just not even stepping foot into a VA. That's a whole nother thing. But yeah, definitely, totally agree. Yes, sir.
Part of it too, though, is responsibility for the military. My friends
Sure.
were Agent Orange. The military was still lying that it was even used. So many of them had cancer and PTSD, but there was no assistance.
So at the end, I think you're going to be interested in what we go in at the very end of those slide presentation. We're going to talk about DHA. It's a relatively new thing. When I say new, post 9/11. And it's a good thing. There's people that have their issues with it, but it's for sure a good thing. And I think it kind of speaks to the lack of resources and support that the Vietnam generation got, for sure. Okay, so now we're going to go into this. This is kind of specific to factors that affect PTSD, specifically by the job or the MOS. So it's what you were doing when the traumatic event happened. I'm going to go into more of a combat. I'll get into that in a second. So job MOS when experienced a traumatic event. Obviously, if you were a combat arms person, or you were a soft guy, or you were, let's say, in a medical role, there's going to be other aspects of the overall situation that are going to affect you differently than they would, say, somebody that was in a completely different role. Not necessarily worse, not necessarily better, but different, for sure. Think about medical people. This generation has got a big thing with, pogues. There's like grunt pogue things. There's this whole big thing. There's always been a dynamic in the military between combat arms and combat support. There always has been. There always will be. There was probably in the Civil War, but that's not going to go away. But what I think has become interesting with a large-scale, long-term war like OIF and OEF is that it kind of brought another demographic within veterans or combat veterans. There was people that went overseas 4 or 5 times, and never potentially left the wire. They never left their base. These were people that did administrative stuff, or they did IT stuff, they did comm stuff. There's still a piece to it, and it's easy to say, oh, well, if you weren't pulling triggers or getting triggers pulled at you, then, and that's certainly a major thing right now in the military, divisiveness. But the reports show that that's not really a good indicator. So I'm kind of against that line a little bit. And I'll tell you another reason why. You look at people that are or have been in a non-traditional combat role that, due to the nature of OIF and OEF, were put into a combat role. There's probably some trauma involved in that that's a little bit greater. If somebody had a 15-year career where they were administrative person or supply person. The war popped off. We went over there. We did a major thing. Next thing you know, everybody's getting tasked to do convoys. The combat arms folks that were doing that over the course of their career and through their training pipeline, they've been semi-adapted to the idea that, hey, this is real. You might have to pull the trigger. You might have to do this. This is what you're here for. Whereas you had folks that maybe never really got that, maybe in boot camp or something, but they never realistically received that injection, you know what I mean, into themselves. Well, then they go over earlier. I'll give you a great example actually right now. Jessica Lynch. We all remember the whole Jessica Lynch thing. There were some reports that came out of that were because that's right about when I came in, mind-boggling to me. Some of these people hadn't shot, or in country, hadn't fired a weapon in 2 years, 3 years, having trouble. I mean, the military failed them to throw these people that were not adequately trained into that situation. There's got to be some trauma involved with that. Just the fact that, number one, you felt like you weren't prepared for what you were doing, and number two, you just weren't in the right state of mind to be doing what you did. You did it because you had to. That's admirable. But that was a military failure, and that's something to be thought about. So the whole job MOS thing, we could talk about that for like the next 2 hours, which I don't want to do, and I know y'all don't want to do. So it's just something to think about, though. That's something to think about for sure. Public perception of the conflict. So we know why that's there. That's there for the Vietnam folks. They didn't get support. It was just the failure that we as a nation, as a society, the way that we failed the Vietnam vets. Hopefully it never happens again. Very sad, very big failure on our part. That has a lot to do with probably, I'm assuming, the things that we talked about earlier in the last slide about the Vietnam generation of guys and girls, that they just weren't supported, and there was a lot of repression. And then thankfully, it's not thankfully that we went to another war, but thankfully we did a better job with the Desert Storm, Desert Shield guys, and the OIF, OEF guys. I think that kind of maybe gave, if not a renewed sense of pride, at least a renewed sense of entitlement's not the word that I want to use, but that's kind of what I'm getting at. It's that they recognize, hey, you know what, the American people do owe me something. If I'm going through this or that, or I went through that, and it's been plaguing me for the last 40 years, I rate help with this. So I like to think that the OIF, post 9/11, maybe even Desert Storm time frame, kind of maybe remedied some of the effects of the negative perception that we had in Vietnam. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry to keep asking so many
No,
questions, but you
please,
brought
I'm
Jessica
going really
Bush.
fast. Keep asking.
And, I remember I didn't really understand what's going on with her, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But kind of recently I saw an article about her that she was like doing great and stuff like that.
Jessica Lynch, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, Jessica Lynch.
She's a teacher.
In your personal opinion, kind of knowing what she might have gone through, do you think she is okay?
I think it's all subjective to the person. There's no telling. I think that there's people that can go through hellacious trauma, and I don't want to use the term walk it off, but there's people that can accept things, there's people that can't accept things. I don't know her. I know her short story. I have a friend that was part of the rescue thing, but that's the extent of my knowledge. I saw the article. I think she got married, she got a little kid.
Yeah, I mean, like,
She's a
I
teacher,
think it's
elementary school
great.
teacher, I think.
Yeah.
But you know what? Who knows? Who knows what happens behind closed doors? Who knows?
No, I just wondered
I hope
if
so.
you have friends, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I hope so. Okay, we're going to do a break. Alicia, how many minutes? 10, 15 minutes? Thanks. During that little break, there's a couple questions I'm going to try to bring up, or a couple comments that were brought up to me. I'm going to try to talk a little bit more to the group as a whole, but I'm going to kind of trickle them in as I feel like they fit throughout the presentation. Alrighty, so we talked about the MOS stuff. A gentleman here brought up, and actually I'll drop this in right now. He mentioned there being sort of a pecking order to job-related PTSD specific to the military, and I think that's a really valid point. We kind of shared it a little bit earlier, talking about traditionally non-combat roles being put into a more combat-centric role. That's a valid point, but I think it's also true, especially on the medical side. And the reason I'm going to say that is that OIF and OEF, so Iraq and Afghanistan, both saw some pretty revolutionary changes when it came to tactical medicine, both for the people on, the corpsmen or the Army combat medic and the soft medics for sure, but also on the stabilization side. So we had shock trauma platoons and FRISs. The Army had FSTs, forward surgical teams, and then FRSS, something forward resuscitative surgical suite, I think was the term. But anyway, these were like MASH units it was like a smaller, less built up MASH unit. And then later on, they also had another one that was called, I think, ECT or TCE or something. And those were actually straight up mobile. So these were, an actual mobile medical team. Those were full of physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, PAs, techs, X-ray techs, a variety of techs. These are people that we don't typically think of in a combat role, that were filling a combat role, and at times were filling an extremely heavy combat role. Afghanistan in 09-10 in Southern Helmand Province, when Task Force Leatherneck was there, they put out, I think, 3 of those teams to include one of the mobile ones. These people were seeing insane amounts of trauma, and they were all doing it. These are nurses, these are doctors, these are healthcare professionals that are used to, let's be honest, the finer things in life, and they were out there, using wag bags and all this stuff, not showering, all the while doing, what is their purpose, which is providing healthcare. It's kind of an extreme case, and I don't really have any friends or any people that I know that did those jobs. I've known a few professionally, but not on a personal level. But that had to have an impact. If you had a 20-year career where you're used to working in a sterile environment at a hospital, and then you're shotgun into this thing where you're like, whoa, your bearing's completely off, it's got to have an effect. So I do think that there's a pecking order to the military where we in which I support. At the end of the day, the gunfighter is who everyone's supporting. I'll always think that, but for sure we need to think about the way that we treat PTSD with people that we otherwise don't typically think of as being in a combat role. So really, really good point. Thanks for coming over and bringing that up to me. Public perception, we talked about that. A gentleman came over and talked to me, or we spoke about the public perception. Actually, two people, and a woman too, regarding a couple things, just obviously sort of the failure that we did to the Vietnam generation, as well as a good point was brought up about the draftee military. There's something too about people that were not volunteers, guys that were drafted. That's a whole kind of another contingency. There was a dissonance there where these guys didn't want to be there, were there, against their own will, did it, and I could definitely see there had to have been an ambivalence there. So those are both really, really great points that were brought up to me on the sidebar. A couple other things: where the war's fought, type of enemy involved. That kind of goes back to the mount stuff. The last couple wars have been pretty similar. A little bit of a disparity in population between Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not so sure that has any really major impact, but it might. Who knows? Resources and treatment. So we're going to talk about some treatment. I know there's a bunch of therapists here. So cognitive processing therapy. I'm not a therapist. I'm going to kind of talk it a little bit, my understanding of it. Cognitive processing therapy, it kind of deals with stuck points. So it's the concept of people getting stuck on something and trying to work through it. So the thing you'd be stuck on would be the traumatic event that took place. It's kind of working. It's psychotherapy that is multi-sessions, and it's getting people through that. Prolonged exposure therapy, that's forcing, or their therapist forcing people, this can be in a group setting or in an individual one-on-one setting, but it's forcing a person to go back and avoid and deny that avoidance symptom of trying to not think about it. So it's forcing oneself to completely go over and over and over and over and over that traumatic event. And then this one's super, super cool. I'm not smart enough to talk it really, so I'm going to try. There's probably people here that know it. They're going to think I'm an idiot, but eye movements, desensitization, and reprocessing. Super cool. So the idea is you use bilateral sensory stuff. So bilateral sensory stuff would be merging your eyes left to right, right to left, or I think finger tapping is one that they do. So you do like finger tapping left and right like this, while having a traumatic image or a traumatic event brought up. The idea, I don't know. I'm not smart enough, but it's kind of controversial, but they say it's really good and it sounds cool. So it's bilateral sensory stuff while you're being exposed to a traumatic event.
It's not really controversial anymore. It's a well-established modality.
The VA uses it, so yeah, the VHA is adopted.
It's mainstream medicine.
Yeah, it's very interesting. In fact, do you want to talk about it for a second?
Yeah, sure. I've been doing EMDR for about 25 years. I've worked with it successfully with a lot of people with a variety of trauma, and sometimes, it doesn't always happen, but sometimes you actually get pretty instant, immediate results. Sometimes it takes a few sessions, but it's really extraordinary. People were really stuck, and the odd thing is just kind of like, we don't know why the honeybee flies according to aerodynamics. It's like, it doesn't make sense, but we know, in fact, it does. We don't really know why EMDR works. There are theories about it, but we know it works. And there are trainings involved. You can take different levels of the thing and become certified. So for those of you who are therapists, I highly recommend that you do it.
Where it has its roots is typically on the side.
That's what you can't hear.
Well, I was going to say that just in terms of EMDR, what happens is when we have a traumatic event, it runs in the right side of our brain. The EMDR helps it move to the left side in order to get fog along.
Okay.
So it like, there's a big piece of that.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Yeah, thanks. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Medications, I'm not going to get into that, but antidepressants, SSRIs, SNRIs. Now here, that was more on the treatment side. I'm going to talk about some resources. And each thing that we talk about, I'm going to bring up the resources because I think it's important for anybody that works in a counseling / behavioral / medical role to know about some of the resources that are there. Despite the fact that you may not work at a VA, or you might not work for DOD, or you might not work for TRICARE, there's veterans all over the place, 7.6% or whatever it is. So I think it's a good thing to know if you're treating patients and or seeing patients and or taking care of people and or family members or friends. It's important to know the resources that we have out there for folks. So About Face and MakeTheConnection.net. So these are .gov sanctioned things. About Face is a PTSD tool. It's an online site, and then MakeTheConnection.net is similar. It's kind of where there's videos. So there could be an issue, let's say PTSD, depression, suicidal ideation, any of these issues, and you go to them, and it'll be real people videoed talking about how they worked their way through that same problem. It's really cool. The VA is pushing it really hard right now. VA.gov, there's a link for it. MakeTheConnection.net. About Face, it's similar. I'm not that familiar with it, to be honest with you. The National Center for PTSD, you can get to that via .gov too. It's the all's all and the who's who of what's what of PTSD. PTSD program locators. That's an interesting one. There's going to be one of those for each person. Each VA is going to have one. It's basically like a social worker type person that can tell you what resources you have for whatever the issue is. Some of that's dependent on discharge and all this other stuff, but we'll get into that. And then vet centers. Every VA has a vet center. There's also some vet centers at the C-Box, which are little outpatient clinics. The vet centers are important, and one of the things that's important about them is that there's people that, for whatever reason, didn't get good discharges. That can limit some of the treatment that you can get, depending. Mental health is kind of a different one. You can kind of get it anyway. But anyway, vet centers are good. You go in there with the DD-214, which is the military discharge paperwork, and you're going to get seen. It's an important thing. No waits. You go in there, hey, I need help. Help me. And it's going to go. So that's pretty cool. Depressive disorders. We're going to go through these real quick. It's very similar symptoms, marked by feelings of intense sadness and hopelessness. Once again, loss of interest in things or activities that once brought pleasure, guilt, detachment from others, and then both ends of the polar line for sleep and eating. Obviously, many similar signs. Pre-existing history of depression disorder is reported to be a risk factor for PTSD. This is interesting. Many reports state that half of those suffering from PTSD are also suffering from some level of depression. The next is going to be a little, what do they call them, pie graph that shows that. So there you go, if you're more of a visual learner. But it's a little over half or a little under half. Go back to the resources for that. A couple different types of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, CBDD, acceptance and committance therapy for depression, and then interpersonal psychotherapy. It's kind of all three of those are pretty much working sort of from a self and environment standpoint. Vet centers, counseling, again, you're going to see vet center over and over and over again for everything that we talk about, but regardless of enrollment. So when I went back and was saying that only a third, it's right around a third of veterans are enrolled in the VHA, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be enrolled. You just go into the vet center and say, here's my DD-214, help me, and they're going to help you. So that's good. And then local recovery coordinators, just like I was talking about on the last one, there's a different word for them, but it's the same thing. It's the people that can let you know what your resources are, what resources are available to you. There's one of them at every VA. All right, so now we're going to move on to suicide. It's obviously a hot ticket item. It's something we're hearing about on a regular basis. There's a lot of numbers out there, and there's a lot of brands regarding suicide. What I'm going to put out, and this is via va.gov, is between 2008 and 2016, there was an average of 6,000 veteran suicides a year. That number, if you divide it by 365, is I think like 16.4 or something like that. So that's the number. More importantly than the number is the second one, which is 2016, the suicide rate was 1.5 times greater for veterans as opposed to their civilian counterparts. And that is age and gender, what do they call it, modified or adjusted. That's significant because we all know that the younger ages are at a much greater risk for suicide. So that has been adjusted. So that's a pretty legitimate statement. You can see, kind of going with it, it's actually the same report, showed a substantial increase in suicides in the 18 to 34-year-old generation, or age group. Again, that's the most at risk. Pre-existing conditions, every single thing that we talk about today is a pre-existing condition, or excuse me, is a risk factor for suicide or suicidal ideation. This is kind of a good one to show off of that number that I showed earlier. You can see it's a rate per 100,000. This was in 2014. You can see the difference between male and male, female and female, veteran to civilian. It's substantial. It's definitely substantial. Talk about some warning signs. Once again, we're going to be repeating ourselves because they're all on all of the slides. Hopelessness, anxiety, agitation, sleeplessness, substance abuse, big one. Withdrawal from family, withdrawal from activities that once brought one pleasure. Engaging in risky behavior. Again, that kind of goes back to that self-destructiveness. Substance abuse, we brought it up twice. I don't know why. Similar risk factors as PTSD and depressive disorder. They're all certainly tied into each other. I added this, and I almost deleted it, and then I added it, and then I deleted it, and I just left it in there. I don't really have an opinion on why this is, but it's a thing, and it's a similar number compared male to female as it is on the civilian, in the civilian world. So I'm not so sure why I'm bringing it up. We all know males are more likely to use a firearm when committing suicide. Male veterans probably have more of a familiarity and a comfortability with firearms. It's nothing revolutionary about that, but it's in every single slide, so I'm bringing it up because maybe there's something that you guys will get out of that I'm not getting. So, did you have something for that?
No.
Okay. Me either, to be honest with you. Yeah. It's kind of, it's thought-provoking, but I don't really have an answer. Yes, sir.
I did want to.
Okay.
I know there are resources available, but I think the larger issue is that at the point that someone becomes a veteran, they're no longer active duty, and then they become symptomatic, or they come home on deployment, they become symptomatic, and the situation is not treated. I think what this calls for, regardless of the mode of suicide attempt, that there has to be ways of helping people with the trauma shortly after the trauma occurs rather than waiting. Because I think that's what's driving up the suicide rate.
Sure, yeah, totally. Makes sense to me. Yes, ma'am.
I would say about that last slide, one takeaway from it would really be on the preventative side. So I know you were saying a lot of folks in here were counselors, and when you're looking at safety planning and ways to help people to be able to stay right, making sure that we're taking care of those risk factors.
Sure. Yeah, I could see that. Resources available. Again, we're going back to a lot of the same things, but there's a couple that are interesting on this one. Make the connection. We talked about that already. That's for pretty much all issues. Suicide prevention coordinators. Again, that's a resource coordinator, somebody that's letting you know what resources are available to you. Then the top three are kind of interesting. So the Veterans Crisis Line, 24/7, 1-800-273-8255. You call it, you hit the number 1 button, you're going to talk to a person. They have some cool new things too for the new techie type folks. There's like you can text and you can, blah, blah, blah. But hit 1, you're going to talk to a human. VA ACE cards, Act Care, Escort. It's kind of like a tool for how to treat somebody that's displaying suicidal ideation. And then on top of that, there's Coaching into Care. It's a course where they'll teach you how to deal with suicidal ideation when it comes across you. Not you personally, but another person expresses it to you. So those are cool training tools. Alcohol and drug abuse. So sometimes use and abuse in an attempt to self-medicate, soften the effects of a different or actual mental health condition. I'm going to throw this one in. It'd be hard to deny. There's certainly a link to alcohol usage, even alcohol abusage in the military. The military and DoD in general is trying to get away from that. I think they're doing things correctly, but it's certainly still prevalent. And if anything, it's getting worse. which is interesting because as of right now, alcohol consumption in the U.S. is actually dropping. There's been a trend for like 10 years now of it dropping while it's increasing in the DoD side. So there's definitely a culture aspect to it. CDC does these really weird things, and one of them is how much alcohol different professions consume daily, or how many days a year people are consuming alcohol, right? So the military is number one. They're the number one profession for consuming alcohol. It's like 130 days, and I think in the last last 4 years, that number has actually increased by like 34. So it's not going down, it's going up, and at the same time it's going up, the regular U.S. society is going down. So it's kind of showing a little bit of a negative trend. There you go. So the number of days spent drinking has been on the rise since 2014. 3 years, 34 days increased. That's just drinking. That's not necessarily saying anything about binge drinking. That could be coming home and having a beer, you know what I mean, or a glass of wine or whatever. Now we're going to talk a little bit about binge drinking. So there's a RAIN report that claimed that 30% of the DoD sampled, I don't know the sample size, reported, binge drinking in the last 30 days. That number is 30% for the DoD, which is all 5 branches. The Marine Corps, 42. Very easy for me to believe. Right? It's definitely a part of the process. So something needs to be worked about. There's another report that I saw. I didn't link it because I couldn't really get it. I wasn't convinced it was legitimate. I couldn't really. I didn't want to put it in there because I couldn't really get a credible source. But there's a similar report that stated the same thing for the veteran community, much lower, but still on the rise. I want to say it was like 14 to 20% or 16 to 22% on the veteran side, so no longer active duty folks. So it's clearly a trend. That, like I just said, that there's been a decrease. This one is an interesting number. This is a .gov and a .mil source, and it's saying that the rise in binge drinking has increased. Drinking and driving, alcohol-related incidents have been on the rise, and DWIs, DUIs, has been on the rise by 60% over the course of the last 5 years. That's the military saying that. So that's significant. That's all, I'm assuming, done off of surveys. Or a combination of surveys, ARIs, and DWIs and DDUIs. That's a significant number. That kind of falls in line with the trend that we just looked at.
Was cannabis use increased in the military?
Good question. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I mean, that'd be an easy number to look at. You just look off of your analysis pops. But yeah, not totally sure. Good question, though.
I think
Yes, ma'am.
we do have to put a little bit of perspective to that, and that is that
Ages?
part of that increase is due to awareness.
Okay, sure.
The commands are putting a kibosh to it where they used to turn a blind eye to
Yeah,
it.
for sure. Sure.
So there again, that's only a little piece of it, but that is one piece of it.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
because the younger ages has always been true.
Yeah. So there's been a big push, even like in the last 10 years, for the military to try to take alcohol out of the culture. You know what I mean? Taking alcohol away from command functions, taking alcohol away from these things. My experience is predominantly Marine Corps, and it's not happening. It's a couple years old now, but yeah, when I was in, for sure. We had Marine Corps functions. Everybody was hammered from the battalion commander down. We were partying. So, yes.
I'd like your personal opinion, because as they're legalizing marijuana in
Yeah.
certain states, do you feel that with people with PTSD that actually could be a better alternative than alcohol?
I don't think that I'm educated enough to make that statement. From a straight up personal standpoint, yes.
Yes.
But you know, I don't want to defend that.
No.
But yeah, for sure. I think that cannabis has got a lot of positives in it. I'll never argue that. Yeah, edibles, vaping.
You see, smoking it is
Yeah.
worse than cigarettes, but
Don't smoke
I believe
anything.
that
I mean,
it's
don't put
better
anything in your
than
mouth.
It could
It's
calm
bad.
down.
it's less addictive. It's has a treatment purpose. It
Right.
helps with anxiety where the alcohol just masks it or is an overdose. I think it's absolutely beneficial and you have to utilize it.
For sure.
But just because it's legal in some states doesn't mean it's legal within the
No,
military.
definitely not. Definitely not. Don't tell anybody that. They'll get in trouble. CBD oil just got banned too. They just put out official instruction on CBD oil. I think like 2 weeks ago. I have a good friend that got wrapped up into some of that, and thankfully it was pre-instruction. But yeah, for sure, you can ruin your life. She knows them too. Yeah, you got to be careful. So Just look up the instruction.
What's the logic of adding the oil? I mean, you wouldn't test positive.
Like I said, I'm supportive, but
Well, and I'm not.
yeah.
I'm just curious what the
Yeah.
logic of the military is, why that would not be allowed.
A lot of illogical things going on. To be honest with you, I'm with you. I'm totally with everybody that's made a comment about it. I agree. Yes.
On NPR, they were talking about CBD oil
Yeah.
earlier this week, and they said because some of the oils are not pure, CBD, they can still have traces of THC.
Yeah.
And if you're using it, especially if you take
so
it
hot.
orally, you can still pop positive.
The incidents I was talking about earlier, that's exactly what it was. It went back to a manufacturer's. It turned into a huge investigation. They went back to the manufacturer of the CBD oil, and it was one of those situations where there was levels that were high enough on THC to pop on a urinalysis. There's a whole instruction. It just came out. I don't know the name of it, but the instruction literally just came out like I think it was 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, in the last month for sure. So yeah, that's a big one. That's a big topic. Opioid abuse. Let's go into another one, another big topic. So we all know opioid abuse is on the major rise in the United States, not the military only, but that's kind of across the board within our society. So some reports, i.e. anybody with any common sense in their mind, is going to connect the pain management of combat-related injuries to veterans eventually developing substance abuse specific to opioids. We've all heard stories. There's a million stories. We could do those for hours. Commonly prescribed in pain management, that's healthcare wide, not just DoD. A 2016 one. This is a really, really, really good report that I read. 2016, it was combat armed service members, predominantly infantrymen. 40% reported chronic pain, no shock there whatsoever. Long-term rucking breaks you down. You do that for more than a couple years and you're going to be hurting. That said, 15% of the sample said that they had used prescribed opioids in the last 30 days. That's a big number. And it's especially a big number when these folks are getting it for long amounts of time, then getting discharged. Now you're 22 years old, already getting out with a GI Bill and an opioid addiction. You're coming out there, you're going through the VA or your healthcare, you're starting to get denied, you're starting to go in there and you're trying to get your med seeking and all this stuff. Turns into a big issue. Next thing you know, you're like, man, this is too expensive. You know what isn't that expensive? Heroin. And then you shoot that in you know what I mean? It's a major issue. And it's not just them. You're seeing it with young athletes. You're seeing it with people that get involved in accidents, people that get hurt, sports injuries, many a thing. So it's a big deal. Studies have additionally shown that prevalence of PTSD, depressive disorder, risk factors as well. We all know all these things are risk factors for everything else. So they're all intertwined. So couple similar resources as everything else we've talked about. There's a couple ones that are interesting. So medications, there's some medications, obviously we all know about that, to prevent relapse and especially to manage detoxification. VA's using all those on the inpatient side, and outpatient actually. And then there's two other things I want to talk about. CBT, it's the same thing, specific to substance abuse. It's actually the other one I was talking about is on the next slide. Contingency management. So contingency management is almost like a NA or a AA, but it's multiple meetings. But as you meet, it's rewards based, and the way that they reward you is off of abstinence. So like unlike NA where you get like the POG, the little circle things, instead of getting that, just saying like, yeah, I've been clean for 30 days. There's no proof of it. Well, with this program, there's actually a panel. You actually take a urinalysis. So it's, some people feel like that's an invasion of privacy. It appears to be working off of reports. So again, if it's not broken. Couple different ones, local recovery coordinators, make the connection. We already know what both of those are because they've been there for each slide. Then opioid overdose education and naloxone distribution. That's a course. There's an online one and an in-person one. It's a way of teaching someone how to, number one, recognize an opioid overdose, and number two, how to distribute naloxone. That's an interesting one. There's an online thing for it too, on va.gov. You can like a PowerPoint thing you can do. You can also go to a VA and you can get that class. It's pretty cool. MST, not necessarily a mental health issue, but certainly, can cause mental health conditions or illness. I wanted to bring this one up because I think it's a really, really, really important thing that the military has made steps in addressing at a time when in the past they weren't addressing it enough. MST is a big thing. So, military sexual trauma. Sexual assault or harassment experienced while in military service. That's how .gov defines it. both men and women. So we know that 91% of the military is, or 91% of veterans, sorry, that's not true. 91% of veterans are male versus 9 for females. 1 in 4 women, a heavy number, 25%, have reported an MST experience, while 1 in 100 men report the experience too. So that's 1% of men as well. Because of the ratio disparity, they're about neck and neck, not too far off. So if you were to look at individual MSTs, there's as many men as women, or it's close anyway. It includes any sexual activity. We have all heard this before. It's coercion into a sexual act without consent. That could be like being asleep, being intoxicated, under the influence of drugs, being physically forced, touched, groped, being threatened with sexual advances, and repeated unwanted sexual comments. We're going to talk about hostile environment too in a second. I think it's the next slide. But the effects, disturbing, and again, going back to how all this stuff has so many corollaries. Disturbing memories, nightmares, PTSD, inability to feel safe, substance abuse and or polysubstance abuse as a means of coping with the trauma, feeling isolated from others, depression, detachment, emotional numbing, sleep issues, and anger and irritability. Again, I think I've read those words now like probably, 30 times today? This is interesting. Sexually hostile work environment. And this is how males versus females in each of the branches would rate that they currently work, or they've, in their military career, there's been a prevalence of what they're calling a sexually hostile work environment. Sexually hostile work environment doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting sexually assaulted, but it means that there's some level of, whether it's pictures on the wall, whether it's people using certain verbiage, whatever, it's there. So you can see the Army, it doesn't even matter. They're all guilty. They're all pretty close except for the Air Force, I guess, in the Coast Guard. So you look at the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, they're all right about 25% is what women are saying. Whereas the men are like, 6%, 3%, 4%, 8%. So that's something to think about. I feel like the 6, 8, 3, 4, 4% of men that are saying it are just a little bit more, either number one, they're not the ones doing it, and number two, they just are able to put themselves into someone else's shoes. Clearly, they're hostile towards the women, predominantly, like extremely prevalently. So that's an interesting thing. This is interesting too. So this could go one of two ways, and I haven't really figured out how I feel about it. So it's the percentage of PTSD issues granted for military sexual trauma versus non-military sexual trauma, right? So non-military sexual trauma would be combat-related stuff, accidents, childhood neglect, or recurring stuff. Everything but sexual trauma, military sexual trauma. If you look at fiscal year 11, this is taking us up to fiscal year 17. See how that's how we've got a trend of them equaling each other. So and again, this is claims granted. This means that the VA is accepted like yes, you have PTSD from an MST, vice PTSD from any of the other issues that we've talked about today. This could be one of two things. I don't know. Is it because MST is on the rise? That's not a good thing. Is it because the VA is getting better at accepting that MST is a major contributor to PTSD? That's a positive thing, right? I mean, we like to see that. So I don't know. I could probably find out if I did some research, but as of right now, I don't know. But I'm interested. And I think people should all be kind of interested in that. Yes, ma'am.
A number of women who had MSD, and a lot of the things that they report too is they didn't come out for the longest time, so maybe they come into treatment for just PTSD in general. We'll talk about combat-related trauma, and then as they,
sure.
And same with the men too, like come into treatment for PTSD, combat-related, and then as they start talking, they start bringing up things.
You're trying to figure out what exactly the trauma-inducing event was?
Yeah, and then for a lot of the females as well, they talk a lot about, because it's, your battle buddies are the ones who are committing the act of doing those kinds of things, and that sense of betrayal is just so huge.
That's what's sad about it is, sexual assault's always sad, obviously. Never anything good about it. But it's even worse, and obviously we know on the civilian side it's true too. It's even worse when it's somebody that's trusted, somebody you work with, somebody you're supposed to be a part of a team, family member, friends, whatever. That just makes it even worse. It's already bad, very bad, but it just makes it even sadder. Kelly.
I think you're seeing an increase in trends because there's a shift in the military. When I left after duty, that there was 2 ways to report sexual assault. You could go to command, and then you could go the private route. So that way, so how sexual assault is being reported. Before, women, or men, definitely men, didn't report their sexual assaults because of the repercussions of that, and then you get isolated. So then, at least in the Air Force, and I think the other services started doing it too, there were 2 tracks to report. One where it could be reported and kept separate from your command, and then another command reporting if you opted to do that. So I think that's why you're seeing a higher increase, is that it's been easier to report that. I think they need to do something similar with suicide and being able to report depression. But if it doesn't get reported to your command and the medical community can just deal with it, that we actually might start to help reduce the suicide rates.
Sure.
Because in the military, the stigma for mental health is just, and I speak from experience, 26 years active duty, I would never, ever step foot in mental health, ever.
It's definitely a big stigma,
Never
for sure.
would I do it. It would make me non-deployable. I wouldn't do it. So we have to find a way for people to be able to reach out for help without getting put in the back shop or because this whole stigma comes with it. And what they did with sexual assaults, I think that they can do with some mental health, if they find a venue to report so it doesn't go to command, let the medical community sort it out. If it gets so severe, then it gets reported to command. So, but I think that's why you see that trend.
Yeah, I like it. So resources, everything we've talked about so far, we've got a coordinator that can allocate resources. We've got vet centers, we've got Make the Connection.net. The one that's different is going to be the VA is doing a good job, I think, or at least is going in the right direction when it comes to MST-related outpatient clinics. They're at the VAs and they're at a lot of the CBOCs. The CBOCs are community-based outpatient clinics. They're smaller ones that are kind of spread out more. So that's a good thing. Those guys and girls can assess, evaluate, treat, and do certain psychotherapies at them as well. So it's a good thing. Okay, I'm going to try to run through this real fast so we can still have like 10 minutes of questions. I know some people have been writing some stuff down. And I'll stay, I'm here. So DHAs, I really wanted to bring this up. I'm going to read this big blurb. It's kind of boring, but I'm going to read it out loud. I don't really know why, but I'm going to. Assigns responsibilities for deployment health activities and prescribes procedures for deployment health activities for joint and service-specific deployments in order to monitor, assess, and prevent disease and injury, to control or reduce occupational and environmental health risks, and to document and link exposures with deployed personnel. Most importantly, to record not only the daily locations, but record everything. So there's a large, it's a general medical piece to it, and there's 3 of them, but there's a large behavioral health aspect of it. So throughout this thing, we've talked about the importance of early detection of mental health conditions, as well as surveillance, kind of keeping your finger on the pulse. It's a frontline issue. It's a frontline issue for unit-specific medical personnel, medics, corpsmen, 18, all these guys. And it's also a major component of DHA. So DHA has three different ones. You have your pre-deployment health assessments, your post-deployment health assessments, and your post-deployment health reassessments. So these are digital, electronically filled out questionnaires. You fill the questionnaires out. There's a bunch of questions. Back pain, this pain, that pain. What meds are you on, blah, 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 all these different things. But there's a big aspect of it which is related to mental health. The pre-deployment one kind of establishes your baseline. Your post-deployment, that's usually done, I think, within 30 days prior, 30 to 60 days, I got it written down. 120 days prior to the deployment. So you'll go out there, that establishes a baseline for the deployment. Then you go on the deployment within 30 days before coming home and or 30 days after coming home, 60-day window. Don't always hit that, but they're supposed to. You've got the health reassessment. This is going to see from your baseline if there's been any negative impacts to your overall health. It's a bunch of things, but I'm going to just talk a little bit about the behavioral health stuff. It's important because there's questions. I couldn't print the whole thing off and it would take too long, but some of the questions. Did you discharge a weapon on this deployment? Witness dead bodies? Did you see local nationals that were killed? Did you see U.S. troops that were killed? Did you see allies that were killed? Did you treat anybody that was wounded? Did you experience a TBI? Were you in a vehicle that was destroyed? Did you see destroyed vehicles. There's a whole bunch of different questions. And then at the end of it, it goes a little deeper, and it says, how would you rate this? Like, how would you rate your overall health? How would you rate, or what is it? It's I think it's been a while since I've done one. How would you, in the last 30 days, in the last 60 days, have you had any feelings of helplessness? And then you've got 5 ones. You're like 1 through 5. A little, no, a lot, yes, I'm helpless all the time. You know, and it'd be helplessness, thoughts to harm yourself, all the classic mental health questions. So you get that. Now you can compare that. DHA compares that to your baseline. Then you do a reassessment. The reassessment is done 6 to 18 months later, and that's again based off or going off of that baseline pre-deployment one. The reason I bring it up, it wasn't really on there. I added it. That just says everything electronically filled out. Figure out what the knowledge of the medical status is. Once you've completed it, you're going to sit down with the healthcare provider. The healthcare provider could be anybody from a physician, PA, nurse practitioner. I've seen nurses used for them in certain situations. If there's certain issues, then they have to default to a physician that's overseeing everything. Army 18 Delta medical Special Forces medical sergeants can do them. Navy IDCs can do them. I'm probably missing somebody, but one of those healthcare providers will look at you afterwards, and at that point, they can push out consults, referrals, and get you, whatever the help you need is. They're going to follow up on it. So that part's important to get people the resources that they need, but it's also important because it's a record. Now you've got a record, and I think it's especially important with multiple, or we're coming off of that now, but at the period of time where we had people going on multiple deployments back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, it was important to not let people slip through the cracks. We did, unfortunately, but this is a tool to try to negate that. So the idea is that if you have, I think I have like 22 of these in my record. So at any point for every pre-deployment and post-deployment, I'm able to look through these things and say, okay, cool, this, was where my baseline was, and then this time I had this happened to me, that happened to me, this happened to me. Yes, ma'am.
Good if you wanted to avoid stigma.
Could I? I'm sorry. What?
Yeah, couldn't somebody fake good?
Oh, yeah. People do it all the time.
So there's no.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. It's just, it's really only so much you can do. You know what I mean? So it's becoming a thing. It's big with the TBIs now, too. That's another one of the reasons that this is getting brought in. They're bringing in ANAMs and all this stuff, which is good. What it is it's basically a subjective documentation, and it's a way to, almost pull your walking wounded away from the general sample, is what it is. And for the VA side of it, the VHA side of it, it's important because that's stuff that it goes into your record, and it can go in there when you're filing a claim. So if you go in for a claim 20 years later, and you're like, hey, I'm having these issues, I think I might have PTSD, I was in, this happened to me, I was in Hasty Ambush, and I had this event that went down, and I'm struggling right now, they could say, okay, open your record, okay, 2005, this happened to this person. It provides a chronological record of care, or record of events. Yes.
Do you think that deep down the military is supportive? Because I would think after several deployments, if you weren't having some mental health issues, there would be something wrong with you.
Yeah, probably right.
Why do they keep doing it?
I think there's a million reasons. I think a lot of the people in fact, everybody that I know that did, like more than 3 or 4 deployments, it was something they wanted to do. And that's problematic as well. And I'm not denying that it's problematic, but I'm just saying that that's the facts. Or not the facts, it's the facts as I know them.
The military members themselves want the deployments.
They want the what?
They want the multiple deployments. You have a lot of military members that just want to go on a deployment because it's like no other experience. And until you're in it, do you get that? There is this bond and camaraderie that you're in the most worst situation ever. You are all uniquely tied to the suck. And there's something addictive about that. So you will have a lot of, when you see these people that are going on their 14th deployment, you have to start looking at that. What are they trying to avoid here?
Exactly.
They're avoiding us here because that's what they do well there.
It's also a profession. It's also a profession. It's something that we get away from. Veterans aren't victims. Some are victims, but as the veteran community as a whole isn't a victim. It's a profession. It's no different than being a doctor. It's no different than being a lawyer. It's no different than being an engineer. It's a profession. Aren't you going to push yourself in your profession? There's a lot of that. There's also everything we're talking about, but this isn't encompassing everybody. There's plenty of people that are doing it because it's their profession, it's their career, they want to excel at their career. How do you excel at your career? You do it a lot. You do the hard stuff.
Yeah, there is a documentary that came out about 7 or 8 years ago, and I'm afraid I may not have the title exactly right. I think it's called Hell and Back, or From Hell and Back Again, something. And it's basically about this young guy you were mentioning before the break, squadron leader, more responsibility, more prestige, never had his entire life. His knee gets blown up, as usual, just like a day or two before he's supposed to go back home, right? So now he's back home, and he has absolutely no clue about how to function in his family. And he wanted to get put on opiates, and now he's really loopy. He doesn't know how to function in his family. And it shows the difference between what this guy was like when he was in the field of operations, right? And it's like master of the universe, right? He's home, and his wife, after a while, you can see the strain on her face because of what she has to put up with. Because she doesn't know how to help him, and he's making her crazy. And that's something that just doesn't get dealt with very much.
For sure, yeah, no, I agree. I just read a thing, real fast. I've just read an article, it's like a 5-page article. I forgot the name of it. It was about two brothers, twin brothers, somewhere in the Midwest they were from. Very similar lives, twin brothers, obviously shared both parents. Kind of a good baseline. Both went in the military, both kind of gravitated toward the same thing. One was a MARSOC guy, one was a SF guy. And they went through their life, went through 5, 6, 7 deployments each, and then got out. Both of them got out about the same time, and then went about their life. And it was just kind of interesting to see how their lives culminated both the same way, to include resulting in one of them killing himself and the other one overdosing on whippets or whatever. So anyway, it's an interesting one. If anybody ever sees that, it's called like Brothers of War or something like that. It's a big page. That's like 6 pages. It's really, really good. It's very interesting. And it kind of ties everything we just talked about today together. It's got the mom in it. It's sad, but it's a good read though. I think we went through all this, general health questions, mental health, sleep history, sexual health, combat exposure, environmental exposures. That's another big one. I'm not going to get into that because this is a mental health thing, but that's another really good thing about DHA is the environmental exposures. The gentleman that was talking earlier about Agent Orange, and now we've got some of the Gulf War stuff. Right now there's a couple of screenings for burn barrels. There's a bunch of this stuff. Anyway, it's smart. The surveillance is key, not just with mental health. That's general healthcare. So that's good. Avoid people slipping through the cracks. Resources. At the beginning, I told you all this is everything I said comes from 80% of what I said comes from the first two, which is va.gov and mentalhealth.va.gov. The DAV had some stuff. Mayo Clinic had some stuff. PTSD.va.gov. That's a good one too. PCSSnow.org. Don't remember what that one was, but something in there said it. And then pdhealth.mil. That's all about the DHAs. If anybody is actively treating veterans that are having some issues that came on their time in active duty, the DHAs are a really good thing to get into. It's going to give you a good record of care that you probably otherwise couldn't get. So that's all I have for y'all. Any questions? I know we're really fast. I'm staying here. Anybody wants to talk about anything in the group? We've got 5 minutes. Yes, ma'am.